All information gathered in this video has come from a range of sources, and all footage, music, images, of information used in this video completely belongs to the copyright owners. All information is correct at the time of publishing. Copyright disclaimer: under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing.
In 1944, at the age of 15, Marceline Loridan-Ivens was arrested in occupied France, along with her father. They were sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. When they arrived, they were forcibly separated. Though he managed to smuggle a last note to her via an electrician, she never spoke to him again. This video is Marceline's letter being read, addressed to the father she would never know as an adult, to the man whose death has enveloped her life. With poignant honesty, she tells him of the events that have continued to haunt her, of the collapse of their family, and of her efforts to find a place in a changing world. This is a breathtaking memoir by an extraordinary woman, and an intimate and deeply moving message from a daughter to her father. I was quite a cheerful person, you know, in spite of what happened to us. We were happy in our own way, as a revenge against sadness, so we could still laugh. People liked that about me. But I'm changing. It isn't bitterness, I'm not bitter. It's just as if I were already gone. I listen to the radio, to the news, so I'm often afraid because I know what's happening. I don't belong here anymore. Perhaps it's an acceptance of death, or a lack of will. I'm slowing down. And so I think about you. I can picture the note you managed to get to me back there, a stained little scrap of paper, almost rectangular, torn on one end. I can see your writing, slanted to the right, and 4 or 5 sentences that I can no longer remember. I'm sure of one line, the first, "My darling little girl," and the last line too, your signature, Schleim. But what came in between, I don't know anymore. I try to remember and I can't. I try, but it's like a deep hole and I don't want to fall in. So I concentrate on other things. Where did you get that paper and pencil? What did you promise the man who brought me your message? That may seem unimportant today, but then, that piece of paper, folded in 4, your writing, the steps of the man walking from you to me, proved that we still existed. Why don't I remember? All I have left is Schleim and his darling little girl. They were deported together. You to Auschwitz, me to Birkenau. Afterwards, history linked those two places with a simple hyphen. Auschwitz-Birkenau. Some people just say Auschwitz, the largest death camp of the Third Reich. Time obliterates what separated us, it distorts everything. Auschwitz was built behind a little town, Birkenau was in the countryside. It was only when you went out through the large gate with your work detail that you could catch a glimpse of the other camp. The men from Auschwitz looked toward us and thought, that's where our wives, our sisters, our daughters died, and that's where we'll end up, in the gas chambers. And I looked toward you and wondered, is it a camp or a town? Has he gone to the gas chamber? Is he still alive? Between us stood fields, prison blocks, watchtowers, barbed wire, crematoriums, and above all else, the unbearable uncertainty of what was happening to us all. It was as if we were separated by thousands of kilometers. The books say it was barely 3. There were very few prisoners who could move between the two camps. He was an electrician, he changed the odd light bulb in our dark prison block. He appeared one evening. Or it might have been a Sunday afternoon. Anyway, I was there when he came, I heard my name, Rosenberg. He came in, he asked for Marceline. That's me, I replied. He handed me the scrap of paper, saying, this is a message from your father. We only had a few seconds, we could have been killed for that simple act. And I had nothing to answer you with, no paper, no pencil, objects no longer existed in our lives, they formed mountains in the storehouses where we worked, objects belonged to the dead. We were slaves, all we had was a spoon wedged into a seam, a pocket, or a shoulder strap, and a band tied around our waist, a bit of fabric torn from our clothes or a thin rope found on the ground to hang our metal bowl from. So I took out the gold coin I'd stolen while I was sorting out the clothes. I'd found it in a hem, hidden as if it were some poor man's treasure, and I'd wrapped it up in a piece of cloth. I didn't know what to do with it, or where to hide it, or how to trade it on the camp's black market. I handed it to the electrician. I wanted him to give it to you. I knew he'd steal it. Everyone stole in the camp. In our block, you could always hear people crying, "Someone stole my bread." So I stammered in a mixture of Yiddish and German I'd learned in the camp that if he intended to keep it, he should give you half. Did you get it? I'll never know. I read your note right away, I'm sure of that. Other words you said, I didn't show it to anyone, but I told everyone those words were my father wrote than anything. You said them at Drancy, when we still didn't know where we were going. Like everyone else, we said over and over again, we're going to Pichapoy, that Yiddish word that stands for an unknown destination and sounds so sweet to children. They would use it when they talked about trains as they set off. They're going to Pichapoy, they'd say out loud, to reassure themselves after the adults had whispered it to them. But I was no longer a child. I was a big girl, as they say. In my bedroom at the chateau, I'd redecorated, put a stop to my dreams, got rid of my toys, drawn many crosses of Lorraine on the wall, and hung pictures above my sky-blue desk, portraits of generals from the First War. Foch, Joffre left in the attic by the previous owner. Do you remember when the principal of the school in Orange asked to see you? She'd found my private diary that was full of dark rumors and reproaches about the chief supervisor and certain teachers, but most importantly, a fierce defense of de Gaulle. Your daughter will have to appear before the disciplinary committee. It would be better if you withdrew her from school, she'd said, in order to protect us. She gave you my diary. You probably read it and found out I was in love with a boy I met on the bus that took us back to Ballin after school. I gave him my bread ration tickets and in exchange, he did my maths homework. He wasn't Jewish. You didn't speak to me for 2 months after that. We'd reached the age when we would fight, a father and his 15-year-old daughter. So at Drancy, you knew very well that nothing escaped me when I saw you and the other men looking so serious, grouped together in the courtyard, united by a whisper, by the same premonition that the trains were headed far away to the east and the land you all had fled. We'll work over there and we'll see each other on Sundays, I'd said. And you'd replied, you might come back, because you're young, but I will not come back. That prophecy burned into my mind as violently and definitively as the number 78750 tattooed on my left arm a few weeks later. That prophecy became a terrifying companion, in spite of myself. I clung onto it sometimes. I loved those first words when my friends, and the ones who weren't my friends, disappeared one by one. Then I rejected your prophecy. I hated the words "I will not come back," words that condemned you, separated us, seemed to offer up your life in exchange for mine. I was still alive, were you? Then there was the day when we passed each other. My work detail had gone to break up stones, pull along small trucks, and dig ditches along the new road for crematorium number 5, and we walked in rows of 5. As always, we were going back to the camp. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening. Do you know that this moment we shared doesn't belong to just us? That it is part of the memories of the people who survived and is mentioned in their books. For all the dreams of being reunited burst forth in the camp of industrial death, the bodies of all our family who were still alive shuddered when we saw each other, when we broke free from the ranks and ran toward one another. I fell into your arms, fell with all my heart. Your prophecy wasn't true, you were alive. They could have judged you useless from the moment you'd arrived. You were in your early 40s, a bad hernia in your groin meant you had to wear a belt, there was a long scar on your thumb from when you were injured at the factory. But you were still strong enough to be their slave, like me. You were meant to live, not to die. I was so happy to see you. Our senses came alive again, the sense of touch, the feel of a body we loved. That moment would cost us dearly, but for a few precious seconds, it interrupted the merciless script written for us all. An SS officer hit me, called me a whore, for the women weren't allowed to talk to the men. "She's my daughter," you cried, still holding me tightly in your arms. Schloim and his darling little girl. We were both alive. Your logic didn't hold up anymore. Age had nothing to do with it. No logic existed in the camp. The only thing that counted was their obsession with numbers. We'd either die right away or a little later, but we wouldn't make it out alive. I had just enough time to give you the name of my prison block. I'm in 27B. I was beaten so hard that I fainted, and when I came to, you were gone, but I found a tomato and an onion in my hand that you'd secretly slipped to me your lunch, I'm sure, and I hid them right away. How was it possible? A tomato and an onion. Those two vegetables hidden beside me made everything possible once more. I was a child, and you were my father again, my protector, the one who kept me fed, the head of a business that manufactured sweaters in his factory in Nancy, the slightly crazy man who bought us a little chateau in the south, in Ballin, and took me there in a horse-drawn carriage, looking all mysterious, so happy about your surprise that you asked, "What do you wish for most in the world, Marceline?" The next day, our work details passed each other again. But we didn't dare move. I saw you in the distance. You were there, so close to me, very thin, wearing a baggy striped uniform, but still a magician, a man who could astonish me. Where did you get the tomato and onion that brought such joy to my stomach and of friends? All we were given was some murky, warm liquid when we got up, a little of which I kept to wash myself with, then soup at noon, a piece of bread in the evening, and once a week either a grayish slice of imitation sausage, a teaspoon of beet jam, or a bit of margarine to spread on 2 slices of bread. Where did you get the paper to write to me? We had nothing to wipe ourselves with in the latrines. I used to tear off little strips of material from a pair of stained men's underpants that was thrown in my face when I arrived, only too glad to use it up a little at a time to wipe my bottom, but I felt embarrassed and ashamed. I don't know how much time passed between those two moments, those two gestures, the last between us. Several months, I think. Perhaps less. You remembered my block number, the first in the row closest to the crematorium, and you had the message brought to me. You didn't sign it Papa, but your first name, in Yiddish, Schloim, that became Solomon in France. You had returned to the land where you were born, which hadn't waited for the Nazis to persecute the Jews. You surely needed to affirm your identity, your Jewishness, in this universe where we were nothing more than stuck things. Perhaps you even found some of your relatives again in the camp, cousins from Poland, who always called you Schloim. Still today, whenever I hear the word Papa, I'm startled, even 75 years later, even when it is spoken by someone I don't know. That word disappeared from my life so early that it hurts, and I can only say it deep in my heart, never out loud. And I certainly couldn't write it down then. In your message, you must have begged me to hold on, to live. Such ordinary words, words used instinctively, the only words reasonable men have left when they can't imagine the future. You must have used the imperative form of those verbs. But I probably didn't believe what you wrote to me. Not as much as I believed in a tomato or an onion. Words had deserted us. We were hungry. The massacre had started. I'd even forgotten Mama's face. So perhaps your message had too much warmth at once, too much love. I drank it in as soon as I'd read it, like a robot that is hungry and thirsty. And then I erased the memory of it. Thinking about it too much meant letting in the loss. It made me vulnerable, brought up past memories, made me weak, brought death. In life, real life, we also forget, let things slide, make distinctions, trust our feelings. But there, it was the opposite. The first things we lost were the feelings of love and sensitivity. You freeze inside so you don't die. There, you know very well how the spirit shrivels, the future lasts for 5 minutes, you lose who you are. I never called out for you to help me. And whenever I thought of you, I pictured you with my baby brother. He was 4, and I couldn't remember his name anymore. Michel. He never left your side for a second before we were arrested. Wherever you went, he was in your arms or at your feet, his hand in yours, as if he were afraid of losing you. Perhaps I hid a little bit of myself in his tiny form. That was another way of calling out to you. I was your darling little girl. Even at 15. At any age. I had so little time to save enough of you within me. From my cell block, I could see the children walking to the gas chambers. I remember one little girl clinging to her doll. She looked lost, staring into space. Behind her were probably months of terror and being hunted. They'd just separated her from her parents, soon they'd tear off her clothes. She already looked like her limp, lifeless doll. I watched her. I knew what chaos and anguish runs through a little girl's mind, knew how determined she was, clutching her doll in her hand. Not long before, a few years earlier, I too had left with a suitcase that had a baby doll inside it, and a little box to keep fishing flies in. You must have told me you were still alive in that letter, and not very far away. And promised that soon the war would be over and we'd be free. When was that letter? Summer of '44? A little later? We knew about the landings and the battles. The news came into the camp with the latest convoys. Every time, one of us would try to slip into cell block A, where the new arrivals were still in quarantine, living on borrowed time, between the gas chamber and hard labor. We'd look for familiar faces. We always came back with information. That was how we found out that Paris had been liberated, that General Leclerc's troops had paraded down the Champs-Élysées, and the next day, we'd all very quietly sung the Marseillaise as we passed the orchestra that played military marches and pieces of classical music when we left for work every morning and when we returned at night. But hearing news from a world we didn't belong to anymore wasn't really important. The gas chamber still hung over us, menacing. We were all on the brink. We only lived in the present, minute by minute. Nothing could give us hope anymore. Hope was dead. The Hungarians had arrived. Hundreds of thousands of them. You remember that flood of people, as if entire cities were pouring into the camp. Everything increased, both the numbers and the pace. They undressed them, sent them to the gas chamber, the children, babies, and old people first, as usual. The ones death would claim a few days later were penned up in a part of the camp that had just been constructed, the first section of a new camp, close to the crematorium. We called it Mexico. We walked by it every day on the way to work. We were going to Canada, which is what the Polish women had named the place where we sorted through the clothes, because it was the least difficult job, the one we all hoped for, where we might come across an old crust of bread in a pocket, or a gold coin sewn into a hem. The French women among us would have called it Peru. Strange geography in the miniaturized world of the camp, in Polish. I didn't know why, but Mexico implied impending death. When we passed by, some of the women would come closer to the electrified fence and whisper questions to us. They didn't have their children anymore, but still wanted to hope. We'd ask them if they had a number. No, they'd reply. Then we'd raise our arms to the heavens as a sign of despair. Our tattooed number was our opportunity, our victory, and our shame. I'd helped build the second railway line that led directly to the gas chambers, where their children had just been thrown. Now I was going to sort through their clothes. Death regurgitated so many clothes that I'd been assigned to Canada as an extra worker. We sifted through the skirts, underwear, pants, shirts, shoes of everyone who'd been incinerated and whose bodies gave off the smell of burnt flesh, a smell that hovered over the camp, penetrated deep into our nostrils, our bones, our thoughts, day and night, carrying with it the promise of the same fate. We often sorted through tattered clothes, worn-out shoes in suitcases made of cardboard. And they said the Jews were rich. The worst of the clothes ended up on us, the nicest ones were sent to Germany. We walked around in the rags of our dead, with a red cross on our backs, like you had too. I wore a dead girl's vest, another girl's skirt, the shoes of yet another. But you have to be really alive for objects and clothes to remind you of someone. Back there were too many clothes, they reminded you of no one anymore. The Nazis had turned those clothes into mountains and they rode around them on bicycles, holding a whip, a barking dog in front of them. And I dreamed of a striped dress like the Aryan women had. That lovely dress was made of a single piece of material, it covered your whole body and had never belonged to anyone outside the camp. I ended up thinking there was something mysterious about that dress. Perhaps it was the feeling of belonging that uniforms give you. They tell you where you are and what you are, and also that one day you might be able to take them off. And I stole things. A sweater once. A spoon for a friend. Then the coin, found sewn into a hem, without knowing it would be for you. I remember having no pockets. I didn't know where to put it. I risked a lot if they found it on me. Who could I trust? The majority of the deported women who were put in charge in the blocks were Aryans. They would have denounced me or taken everything I had. The anti-Semitism in the camp was terrifying. The Aryans constantly swore at us. The Polish women, Ukrainians, and the German criminals were the worst of all. And I knew I couldn't keep the coin for long, because once a month we had to send everything to be sterilized to avoid getting lice and typhus. They'd give us dead people's clothes that never fit me. They were always too big or too long, even the very first ones I got when I arrived. I'll never forget them: a skirt that went down to the ground, a small vest, a pair of stained men's underpants that stank of disinfectant, one flat shoe and another with a heel, both too big. I still wear a size 2. I haven't grown much since you last saw me. I think your letter arrived when I was sent to work on the potatoes. We'd left Canada. Some of the women had been caught stealing and sent to the gas chamber. The others were punished and sent to move the potatoes. We walked in single file, unloading the wagons and carrying the boxes to the warehouse, using makeshift crates with handles at the front and back. There were Nazis everywhere, to make sure we didn't steal a single potato. Then there was that day. The little girl. She was holding the front of a crate full of potatoes, and I was at the back. She had no strength left. She was shaking and couldn't keep going. The German SS officer behind me hit the back of my neck so I'd move faster. But I didn't want to. The little girl in front couldn't take a single step. I said I could switch places with her, let her take the back. He hit me even harder, called me a dirty Jew, hit me again. So I moved forward and the handle banged into the little girl's back, every blow to my neck forced me to hurt her. She fell down and couldn't get up, so the Nazi finished her off with the butt of his rifle. I call her a little girl, but she was no younger and no smaller than me, but so fragile, thinner than me, so I remember her as a child. I think she was Greek, and I killed her. Then we were sent to the ditches. We had to dig them with pickaxes. For a long time I told people they were near the kitchens. For 50 years I stuck stubbornly to that lie, told it to others, and especially to myself. It was my friend Frida who made me remember the truth. They were near the kitchens, I said. No, you're making that up. They were right next to the gas chamber. She was right. The crematoriums were working non-stop. They were so overloaded that flames shot out of the chimneys instead of smoke, and the flames were too visible. They were a signal to the Allied planes that were starting to bomb the armament factories close by. So they changed their method. The bodies that had been gassed ended up in the trenches I was digging, sprinkled with gasoline and reduced to ashes by a sheet of flames that spread low across the ground and were invisible to the enemy. After the Hungarians, the ghetto from Lodz arrived. I saw them walking up to the gas chambers. I thought that relatives I didn't know, my aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, were probably among them. You were from Lodz. I kept working. I struck the ground without looking around me, with no memories, no future, exhausted by not having enough to drink or eat. I dug the ditches where the bodies of 50 distant relatives from Lodz would burn. I lived in the present, in the next heave of my pickaxe, or the moment when Mengele, the camp's devil, made us undress and decided who would go to the gas chamber. No one reacted, not me, not the others, when the Sonderkommandos revolted. The Jewish women working in the armament factory had given them gunpowder, but the non-Jewish local resistance members had refused to give them weapons. The Sonderkommandos blew up the crematorium, blew away their shame, for every day they carried the bodies from the gas chambers and threw them into the fire. They fled toward the forest by cutting through the barbed wire fences. They called out to us, begged us to follow them, but we just watched them, exhausted, incapable of following. Anything good no longer seemed to apply to us, it was too late. They were recaptured and killed. Your letter arrived too late as well. It probably spoke to me of hope and love, but there was no humanity left in me. I'd killed the little girl, I was digging right near the gas chambers, every one of my actions contradicted and buried your words. I served death. I'd been its hauler. Then its pickaxe. Your words slipped away, disappeared, even though I must have read them many times. They spoke of a world that was no longer mine. I had nothing to hold on to anymore. My memory had to shatter, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to go on living.